listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Is your boss spying on you right now? Aussie employers can be notorious for it, and last month, Woolies came under fire for its practice of intensely monitoring the productivity of some of its workers, reportedly using technology to assess their minute-by-minute productivity.
We're actually more monitoring and surveillance focused than the average countries around the world, and I would argue it's a 20th century management style imposed on a 21st century management culture.
Benion Siebert's deep dive on workplace surveillance is coming up in the second half of this episode. Right now, though, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Tuesday, November 12.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. The Treasurer has made a pretty frank admission on the cost of living overnight.
Yeah, we know we've got a lot of ground to make up. Australians are doing it really very tough, and they'd be doing it even tougher were it not for our cost of living help.
That was Jim Chalmers speaking on the ABC's 7:30 there, referencing tax cuts, wages policy and energy rebates as the helping measures Labor has already rolled out. He was also asked about what Donald Trump's victory will mean for Australia, saying we are well placed and well prepared, but not immune from escalations in trade tensions. On Trump's policies around tariffs, so a general 10 to 20% tariff and a 60% one on Chinese goods, he had this to say.
The direct impact on Australia would be relatively mild, but the broader impact on our major trading partners and on the global trading system might be more significant. And in that regard, that is a little more concerning to us.
Yeah, and I mean, we spoke about the tariffs yesterday, Sash. You broke it all down for us in yesterday's headlines if you want to hop back and have a listen. But look, there are fresh concerns as well by employees that we won't be seeing any inflation matching pay increases anytime soon. So a new report by the Australian HR Institute, they survey over about 600 senior HR professionals and decision makers. They found that employers are estimating pay increases will sit at 2.7% for the 12 months to October 2025, and that's down from 3.8%, which was their last reporting period, which were the 12 months to July 2025. Their chief executive has pointed out that CPI inflation is at 2.8%, and that means that employers just won't be offering inflation-matching pay increases to workers, in the near future.
Donald Trump has made another appointment to his administration. The president-elect naming Tom Homan as his border czar to help implement his mass deportation promise. So Homan is the former head of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and he'll be managing all of America's borders when Trump retakes the White House in January. And it's worth noting this particular role doesn't need any overseeing. This can be appointed by the president, which is why Donald Trump has made this announcement. Homan appeared at the Republican National Convention back in July, and he had this message to what he called illegal immigrants in the US.
You better start packing now.
But of course, exact plans for how this mass deportation will be carried out, and also, Chris, how much it will cost, remain to be seen. It is worth mentioning as well that Homan is one of the contributors to Project 2025. Now, this was the ultra-conservative blueprint for the next Republican president, which, they were hoping was going to be Donald Trump, and sure enough, it will be. If you kind of went through the papers and the document, it has a lot of quite hardcore right-wing policies and plans. Donald Trump has distanced himself from Project 2025, though. He says he knows nothing about it and wants no part of it. Whether that's true, I might believe him on that point, but the idea is that the people from Project 2025, as we see with Homan, are going to be part of Trump's administration. So they're inevitably going to have some sort of influence over a Trump presidency.
Yeah, look, and this whole idea about putting strong men into these positions and things like that has been a narrative that we've been hearing a lot in the lead up to the election, and now post-election. Officials back home are sitting there scratching their head going, okay, well, what can we do now to avoid this happening in the future? Interestingly, it was a topic that was discussed on Q&A last night, and the National Party Senator Matt Canavan, he actually said that one of his sons looks to Trump as a, quote, hero. And this is, the further elaboration he provided.
My boys have all constantly been told in school about how the evils of masculinity and how terrible men are, and obviously that breeds a fair amount of resentment. So you can't move away from the fact that there is a whole lot of men in our society that feel ignored right now.
And this was something that we spoke about before hitting record, Sash. You had an interesting take on this.
Look, I think we know Matt Canavan is a professional troll. He likes to come out and make these super provocative statements. I think the disappointing thing around the narrative around young men for me in this conversation is that women are simply asking to not be bashed, raped or killed by men and to be respected and treated as equals. The fact that there are a particular group of men that feel so hard done by this request that they are turning to politicians like Matt Canavan and Donald Trump is really is oversimplifying the issue to me, when it's quite clear that if you feel so offended by women asking for equality, I don't think it's us that has the problem. I think it's you that has the problem. So I'm not saying that we don't need to look at how we talk to young men and I suppose make sure they come along on the journey with us. But that's what I thought we were doing. So I do have to say, like I said, Matt Canavan likes to make these statements, likes to make people like me angry. So I'm not going to let him make me angry. But Matt, I'm disappointed in you.
Yeah, and look, I will say, having worked very, very briefly in education, I can say the sentiment on the ground for young men is really confusing at this time. And it's really challenging as well to navigate. Like, even educators are struggling because they do want to toe the line, like you said, of like, one, it's not all men. Two, the requests of women are very simple. But I think where it gets a little bit complex and messy is when, you know, young kids are opening their devices and being surrounded by messaging that masculinity is toxic, that masculinity is a bad thing. And they can't make that distinction, and the specific examples you've given are not being provided to them. So, I mean, look, it is an interesting space to watch. 56% of young men did vote for Trump, or 56% of young men preference Trump in this election. So, yeah, it's definitely something in Australia we should be keeping a keen eye on as we head into the next election.
3 in 5 Aussie renters never expect to be able to buy their own home. That's according to a new survey from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. So the body used data from the last census, from the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Housing Aspirations data set to work out almost 80% of tenants do actually want to be homeowners.
Yeah, and steep rents, stagnating wages and soaring house prices are all factors in making aspiring owners feel priced out of the market. The number of people renting in Australia across all age brackets has increased over the last decade and are tipped to continue to grow. And this story was something that really stood out to me because I'm now in that stage of life where all my friends are having babies and things like that. And a lot of them are moving back in with mum and dad. And even some of them are contemplating and have already moved in with their grandparents, Sash. And I know you've recently become a homeowner. You're also expecting your first child. Yippee, hooray. We've spoken about on the pod a few times. But was that something that was a major factor in deciding whether or not to have kids?
Yeah, definitely. It's actually going to impact our decision whether we have more kids because we don't know if we live in an apartment, which is great, plenty of space for the two of us. It'll be enough room for a baby, but whether it's enough room for 2 children is a complete other question. We talked about moving back in with our parents to save. We ended up being able to do it a different way, which was a relief because I did not want to live with my husband's parents or with my parents, so we managed to avoid that. So yeah, this survey doesn't surprise me. We see these numbers all the time. It also found this. There was another survey called Better Renting, which found 3/4 of renters received an increased notice in the last 12 months, and 8 out of 10 in that group ended up paying the full amount of the increase. So the costs just keep going up. We are seeing vacancy rates improve a little bit around the country. I think the tide is slowly starting to turn. But the point is, housing is going to be a major political fighting ground for this upcoming federal election. And I'd encourage people listening to do their research on all of the different policies being offered by the major parties, because your vote will matter. If housing is important to you, vote for the party you think is going to deliver that for you.
A very special delivery will be touching down at Adelaide Airport tonight and getting a police escort through peak hour traffic. A 3,500 kilo Asian elephant named Burma. She's flying over from New Zealand today and will make up a herd of elephants at Monado Safari Park.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, it is quite a feat to get such precious cargo out of the airport and to its new home. Burma, who is 42 years old, will get this full police escort. It'll travel through some of Adelaide's busiest thoroughfares from 5 the Savo. A number of roads are going to have closed lanes and reduced speed limits to accommodate the convoy. And the truck she is in will also travel at a reduced use speed the whole way. It is a big undertaking for police and for zoo officials. Once she arrives at the park, she will start a 30-day quarantine period, but she won't be alone because her team of keepers from Auckland have flown over with her and they're going to do the isolation period with her as well, which is good because, I mean, God, it's stressful enough as a human being traveling overseas.
Yeah.
You're an elephant. Like,
No.
it is. And I think, we love zoo animals and we love the joy that they can bring, but that's a lot of stress to put on an animal. So I'm really glad her keepers have stayed with her.
And wrapping up our headlines, hearing from you, our briefers, our listeners, our great listeners who tune in every morning. Listen, you guys have been doing some amazing work out on our Instagram page at The Briefing Podcast, interacting with a whole range of content that we've been popping up. Specifically yesterday, our 2 deep dives. The first one was on student debt, whether the Australian government can afford to wipe student debt and make university free again. And some of the comments that are coming through on the post there have been really, really good and interesting to read. So the first comes from Debbie. She said, tax the rich and the multinational corporations, then education can be free. Another comment came from listener Gabe, who said, we pay enough tax, thanks. And that was reflected by Suzanne in our broadcast channel, who said, that was then, this is now. Times have changed, users pay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Susanna, hardcore.
And of course, we also played an episode about the 4B movement, which is sweeping the US at the moment, where listener Beth left a comment on the Instagram post where she said, quote, I'd be immigrating to another country.
I think that's in response to Donald Trump winning the election.
Yeah, yes, definitely in response to Trump's election win.
Yeah.
And then we had Diogo. He wrote something a little lengthy, but stick with me. Quote, Trump has stopped liberal women degeneracy, promiscuity, and got them to shave their heads so we know who they are. And he isn't even in office yet. Wow, great work.
And I think he was being serious. And I think Diogo is like Matt Canavan and likes to troll people. So I'm going to leave his comment there with no further commentary around it.
Yeah, that's fine. There were about 11 people who have already been taking issue with his comments and replying to. And look, if you guys want to get involved in all the conversations, head to The Briefing Podcast on Instagram. We love hearing from you.
And don't forget to join Behind the Briefing, which is our broadcast channel as well. Chris, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up, we're getting into our deep dive on workplace surveillance and whether your boss is spying on you.
Hey, Benion here. Is your boss spying on you? Last month, Woolworths was under fire for its practice of intensely monitoring the productivity of some of its workers, reportedly using technology and algorithms to assess their minute-by-minute productivity. We've heard similar criticisms of rideshare giant Uber and retail giant Amazon. But it seems office workers are far from safe from this kind of intrusive surveillance either. So-called bossware, that's software that monitors and reports employee performance using tools such as mouse tracking and web browsing surveillance, are becoming more common. So how are you being spied on right now? And as creepy as it might feel, does workplace surveillance make you more productive? Peter Holland is a professor of human resource management at Swinburne University. Peter, welcome to The Briefing. How are bosses monitoring workers these days?
Well, I suppose a good way of looking at it is the alternative way, how bosses aren't monitoring workers today. Smartphones, the technology we're working on, swipe cards. If you name it, I could say that that's a way of surveilling you. Your smartphone, your swipe card, your credit card, they know where you are anytime if they choose to, your employer.
Can you give us some examples of the way that this works in different industries?
Okay, for example, we're talking here now, if my employer chose to, they could put spyware on this computer and basically they can take pictures of me every few minutes to see if I'm actually at my computer. They can also assess the speed at which I type at to see whether I'm working actively at my computer. We've seen the issues with Coles and Woolworths where they're monitoring their workers by the speed that they pack and stock the shelves. Also, Woolworths and Coles, you can see, for example, that when you go through the checkout, when you used to use checkouts, that the checkout would beep. Now, that's to tell you what's going through, but it also monitors the speed at which the worker is working as well. Another one is that I'm sure we've all done it. We've all checked for parcels arriving and we get an update where they are. Those ID chips are also monitoring the driver, where the driver is, the speed they're driving at, and where they are in terms of their delivery. So that's why often you'll see these delivery drivers pull up, almost throw the package at the front door and go off again, because they know that they're being monitored quite severely in terms of where they are and the speed they're going.
What's the best argument for monitoring workers in this way?
Well, the employers' arguments are often around security. Also, if you're working on a computer, if you're working in the finance industry, you could potentially move finances around very quickly if you're about to be sacked. So they need to monitor and surveil what you're doing with your accounts. If you say anything malicious or defamatory, doing it through the employer's computer, they're technically liable because you're representative of them. And also checks and balances, they need to hold a lot of information like emails, etc., if they're needed down the track over certain issues. So there are those arguments, but a bit like this issue that came up with Woolworths and Coles about efficiency, I'm interested in basically identifying what this efficiency actually is at the end of the day. I don't see this necessarily as efficiency by monitoring and surveilling people to that level. In fact, the research indicates that the more you monitor and surveil people, the more likely it is that they are going to be less productive, because they're more watching why and how they're being monitored than actually doing their job. So, for example, if I was sitting next to you and we were typing away and something went wrong with your computer and I knew how to fix it, then my productivity is dependent on me being at my computer and typing. My productivity goes down to help you. Now, in the bigger picture, it's better that I help you and we both are productive. But in this context, I have to think about whether I should leave my computer or not. So you can see that the efficiencies become distorting in terms of what we're measuring. And at the end of the day, I haven't seen any response from the big supermarkets as to why they can justify that level of efficiency. And people have spoken about being bullied. They feel under pressure. Older workers are saying they're picking up injuries. There's a lot of problems that can come from just simply thinking this is a good idea and we will do it.
Can you give us some examples of the way that workers have responded to this? For example, we know that there have been a lot of office workers working from home who've bought mouse jigglers to show their employers that they're still working on their computer if they might be going to the bathroom or doing something else.
That's the classic one, the jiggler. And the other one is apparently turning your mouse upside down. Apparently works. But again, I haven't tried that myself. But there's always ways that people will find to stop themselves being monitored and surveilled. In call centres, for example, if you want an extended break, people, as soon as they're coming up in the queue, they'll pick the phone up and put it down again, so they go to the back of the queue. People are always looking at ways to try and get around it. But I think the key thing is, why do management need this level of monitoring and surveillance? I think the pandemic has got a lot to do with this in terms of Gantner argued that 80% of private companies put some sort of spyware or tattleware, as it's also called, on their workers' computers, often without telling them. It was 90% in Australia. So we're actually more monitoring and surveillance focused than the average countries around the world. And I would argue it's a 20th century management style imposed on a 21st century management culture, where basically, we all work hybrid now. I'm working at home today, but does my employer need to know where I am and what I'm doing every minute of the day? I'd argue probably not.
Could you just dive into that a little bit more for us? So you're saying that 90% of Australian workplaces put some kind of spyware on their computers that their employees use?
Yeah, this was a study done through the pandemic by Gantner, I think was the company, and it's private companies, but the spyware would be loaded up to take pictures of you to see how long you were there, your key speed, what websites you might be scrolling while you're at home. A lot of people only found this out when they went to go and get a coffee or a toilet break and came back and they were logged out with an email saying, where have you been for the last 10 minutes? So a lot of it was done without discussion or knowledge by the employees.
There has been a cultural movement in some parts of social media talking about like lazy girl jobs and deliberately trying to do stuff that means that you do the least amount of work that you can in your job while getting enough done to satisfy the employer. Is there an argument on the employer's side that with so many people working from home now, that kind of behaviour could be encouraged?
It's a good point. I think we had that beforehand. It used to be called presenteeism, where you just turn up to work and do work. But again, in terms of today, we don't work on production lines where, if I made 100 widgets tomorrow and I made 90 today, then my productivity tomorrow will be 10% higher. It's the work that you do. And I think people genuinely go to work to do a good job, and they want to be trusted by their employer. And the flexibility you get from the work, for example, for me, I think I logged on about 7:30 this morning, and then I had a break from about 11 till 12:30. So again, it's the flexibility of working when it suits you rather than the 9 to 5. People will do that, but again, it will come up ultimately in the metrics that are their productivity. And a lot of us work in groups and as well, so within teams. So again, within the team, this is going to be identified. So I don't think it's any better or worse than it was pre the pandemic, when we had presenteeism, people euphemistically walking around the building with a portfolio in their hand or something like that, or tradies walking around with a hammer in their hands, looking like they're going somewhere to do something. I think that's, again, another evolution of the presenteeism argument.
What effect does this kind of monitoring have on employees' mental health and their attitude to work in general?
It's the oppressive nature of it. People knowing continually they're being monitored and surveilled will feel that all the time. The name in the academic jargon is called a panopticon, where you may not be observed, but you know you could be observed. So you're continually aware and aware of it. And it wears people down. Also, as well, it wears down the trust between the employer and the employee. If you don't trust me to do my job, then it's not actually good for the building the employment relationship between the two of them as well. So there's a lot of downside for management as well, thinking that by monitoring and surveilling their workforce, they're knowing they're being productive. They could turn out to be less productive. And in this tight labour market, good employees don't tend to hang around organisations that don't trust them and monitor and surveil them and want to know where they are every second of the day.
If you're someone working in, say, an office job and you realise that you're being monitored and surveilled in a way that feels really insidious, is there anything that you can do about it?
You've probably signed something in your employment contract that allows this to happen. But again, the key factor here is that, are you prepared to risk your job for this? Or the other alternative is, if you're in a union, maybe the union can represent you on this. But again, a lot of this is becoming part of the terms and conditions of employment. You're working on my time as an employer, therefore I have the rights to supervise you. How that supervision is taken or the levels it's taken to aren't necessarily discussed in the contract.
What do you think this might look like in a few years or even further out in the future?
Oh, that is the scary question, because what we've seen in terms of what's happened in the last 5 years, it even shocks me when I update my research and see what's happened. I think the pandemic has brought us probably a generation ahead in terms of the last 3 or 4 years, because working at home was never a big thing in Australia. We did have all these platforms of Zoom and Teams, but companies never really used them because they wanted their workforce to turn up. You've also seen probably in the media, several big companies are trying to drive their workforce back to 5 days a week at the workplace. So they are uncomfortable with this new model that was created through the pandemic. But the average worker who can do that is very comfortable with this flexible work. And the irony is that they're probably more productive. The flexibility of working 3 days at the workplace and 2 days wherever you want increases satisfaction, productivity, and mental health. So there's a lot of positives if management sort of accept it. And I think obviously there will be highlights of people who abuse the system, but there were those same people abusing the system before we worked hybrid. So I think it's a game changer, but I think most people really enjoy the flexibility. Also, well, the key thing with hybrid, and there was a lot of concern in the pandemic of people being isolated, you can't separate work and family, but post the pandemic, I think people are working out what's best for them, whether it's 3 days at work, 2 days at work, 4 days at work. People have worked out now what's best for them and how best to manage their work-life balance. We don't hear as much about people questioning their work-life balance as much when they have the flexibility they now have.
Well, Peter Holland, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
No problem.
Peter Holland there. He's a professor of human resource management at Swinburne University. We sent questions to Woolworths about the technology it uses, whether it monitors workers' break times, and the effect this tech has on productivity. A spokesperson told us the standards Woolworths applies to workers are based on the time it should take a person with, quote, reasonable skill, applying reasonable effort, working at a safe and conscientious pace to complete a task. Woolworths says these standards are consistent across the industry, that they're needed in order to stock stores on time, and that exemptions are built in for workers who need them, such as people who are pregnant or have a disability or injury. Woolworths added that it's speaking to the relevant union about workers' concerns and they're committed to safe and productive workplaces. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this app with someone who wants to know if their boss is spying on them. For heaps more exclusive The Briefing content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Benion Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.